Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Monday Night Live. I'm Derek Arden. Tonight, timely, we have our friend Justin Urquhart-Stewart, the television personality, the business guru, and the financial commentator. Justin, you look embarrassed by that. You shouldn't be. And of course, he's got his branded red braces on, which he always wears on television. Welcome, Justin. Thanks for joining us just after the mini budget, the tax cuts, the interest rate hikes, the inflation rising. What do you make of it all?
Well, I have to say, if that's a mini budget, what the bloody hell does a maxi budget look like? It was really quite astonishing. Everything crammed in. And I have to say, just looking at the way it's put together, it doesn't fill with a great deal of confidence. And particularly over the past few weeks with Mr. Truss's campaign, I have to say, showing any depth of knowledge of the economy seemed somewhat thin to me, to say the least. But at least you can say something. It's something dramatic. It's a change, and a change from certainly what the previous incumbent was. But there are all sorts of issues to unpack here because there are things pulling in different directions. But Derek, I'll leave it to you to direct us as where to go first.
Well, I think let's start with the British economy, then start with the pound, then let's start with the US economy. I've got a number of questions here. They all have the same theme, but, you know, is it the US economy making the pound nearly 1-to-1, or is it our poor economy?
Well, let's address that straight on. Yes, of course, the dollar, in terms of nerves around the world, people will revert to the dollar. Why? Because it's the largest reserve currency. So people see that as a bit more safe, a lovely herd mentality. But that's not the only reason, obviously, for sterling, because we managed to make life particularly different ourselves with regard to Brexit, and that is still working its way through the system. And really a key issue for this, it comes back to that one wonderful word that runs the economy, and I know we've gone on about this before, which is confidence. The whole point, I would have thought, of a prime minister and the new chancellor would be to say, right, we're doing some radical stuff, but the result of this, you should have confidence. Now, the biggest issue of confidence in this one was that there was no validation of any of the math, because normally when you actually have a budget, there is the office of, I've got a title now, basically they check through the budget to actually make sure it's actually making sense.
Budget responsibility, I think they called it. Yeah,
quite right. Well, don't bother to remember it because it's going. It'll be interesting to see actually if it really does go. But what that did, though, was give it a stamp of a level of credibility. Put it around the other way, if you haven't done it, you then get a stamp of incredibility. So they started off, as it were, on the wrong leg. What's going to be interesting, though, we do have this push-me-pull-you effect going on. We've got, obviously, global inflation. We all know about that. Central banks putting up rates. Seems fairly logical. It's a bit simplistic, but in terms of actually addressing inflation, at least it's something. However, that, in theory, if you want to address inflation with that, by putting interest rates up, and you can see why, because if we're in a recession or heading for a deeper recession, you want to be able to cut rates. And when they're close to naught, that's quite difficult. So one of the issues they've got is to make sure it's all very well trying to address inflation. If you then push those interest rates up too high, you probably then put a hard brake on the economy, which of course is diametrically different to actually what the current government's trying to do, which is get the economy going. And so this isn't exactly everyone facing the same direction. So there's a level of confusion here. And life isn't all complete doom and disaster. The good news is sterling is still a reserve currency. And the UK is one of the very rare number of countries in the world that hasn't actually reneged on any of its debt. Virtually every major nation has, but in the case of the United States, not the states, but individual states have certainly done so. So we have a reputation for behaving well with money, and there's a good chance you're going to get your money back. But the difference is this time, you go back 3 months ago, we had the 10-year bond yield at just a tad under, around about 1%, going a bit above that. And of course, here we are now, where on Friday it was actually touching 4%. No, okay, they sound like small numbers, but in terms of the bond market, which remember is about 4 times larger than the equity market, and frankly, much more important. And that means that by charging 4%, you've seen a huge rise in the cost of managing our debt. Figures I know, Derek, I've shown it to you before, but about 2 years ago, and it was a fairly regular sort of level to have, the defence budget was between 45 and 50 billion a year. Funny enough, the interest we paid on our debt was between 45 to 50 billion dollars a year, i.e. the same as the defence budget. Not too complicated figures on the back of a fag packet. Actually, it's quite difficult to find a fag packet these days. But anyway, was to actually then do the calculation again using current figures, and it's probably over 100 billion. Or put that into context, 2 defence budgets or the entire education budget for the United Kingdom. So these are very high sums indeed. So the market is not saying we're not going to invest in you. You think you're Argentina, we'll steer well clear. What they are saying is, yeah, okay, we believe you, but you're going to have to pay more. And that's exactly what you're seeing happening now. So
Justin,
if you therefore...
Can I just stop you there just to talk about a couple of things? So if the 10-year bond yield is 4%, that says Britain, UK is much more risky and might renege on the debt. That's one reason, isn't it? But that also means that long-term mortgage rates are going to be more like 4%, which is going to fuel inflation. Or have I got that all wrong?
No, you haven't got that wrong at all. I mean, all these things connect together. Let me just then address that issue of mortgages. We saw a similar issue about 15 years ago. And people who had fixed rate mortgages would sit there very happily and say, that's great, I'm weathering the storm. Those who've got variable ones obviously suffered the pain. But the real pain came on later with those fixed interest people, fixed interest mortgages, because they then apply to actually renew it at whatever rate it's going to be. But because the banks have tightened up their evaluation schemes as to how good you are or not, you could find yourself with a mortgage running out and not being able to replace it. So you are absolutely stuffed there. And it was something that was of a concern at that time and caused a considerable amount of pain. We may well be in that similar issue. So rates are going to rise. That's, I think, is almost inevitable. But again, we have to take a bigger look at actually what's going on here. It's very easy, particularly with our mini budget and everything, to think it's all us. No, you can see in Japan that we saw last week Honda announcing in 2 of their plants, one dropping at 40 to 40% capacity, the other one at 30% capacity, because the supply chain isn't working. So they're actually having to shut up shop for that. And that's just an indication as to what you're seeing elsewhere around the world. So it's not just us. Equally, of course, you've got the questions with regard to being able to manage this debt money effectively. And again, our reputation means that people will give us that money. But there comes a stage you can keep on rattling the money tree, as they've done once they discovered how to spell quantitative easing. I remember after the first spell of quantitative easing, talking to a mate of mine in the Bank of England, I said, well, it's just, well, we don't have to do that again. And he said, we can't afford to do that again. 8 years later, we've done it again. So every time we go through this process, it just nibbles away again a little bit more confidence that actually does the British government actually know what it's doing. So then you come up with our mini budget, but the question with this mini budget, of course, is this is all being financed by debt, and debt which is now much, much more expensive. So I just fear that we've had a mini budget which was to make sure there was no income. Here she comes, new Prime Minister, we're going to do something which is dramatic. And it certainly is dramatic, that's so. But frankly, I'm much more happier when actually investment is quite boring. So I don't need drama, thank you very much indeed. So there's going to be, I think, further concern with this as it works its way through. Because one of the problems was when G. Brown Esquire, so a couple of decades ago, whispered into Mr. Blair's ear, I don't suppose you know sort of how to whisper, shouted into Blair's ear, why don't we use in our debt, because it's cheaper, why don't we use a lot of the inflation-proof bonds? That's a good idea. It's marvelous when inflation's at 1 or 2%. 10%, 15, 22%, that's not a very clever move. And so they were moving not so much all eggs in one basket, but there were quite a lot of eggs in that one basket, and that's added to it. And it went against the basic principles of the people who run our deficit. It's the Gilt Office down in South Croydon. Not exactly the best thing to spend a day going down there, but they're the ones who keep a weather eye on actually managing that debt, and they will certainly try and adjust the debt to get it the lowest cost possible. It was only 4 years ago we still did have some outstanding debt from the Napoleonic Wars, which had just never been tidied up. So they're doing their best to try and manage that. But putting it all on debt, I think, is actually going to be really rather risky, particularly as the cost of that debt is rising and may well go further.
Is that playing into Labour's hands? They got their conference going on in Liverpool. That's a good place to have a conference, isn't it? But I suppose it's
well, it depends how many wheels you got in your car when you come back.
One of the questions I had was, is this playing all the red wall seats, all the red wall seats or the blue wall seats are all turn Labour? And I think they've got a majority forecast now, 60 seats, haven't they, today?
Well, yeah, you've got to be careful, because remember, Labour lost its heartland in Scotland. And you couldn't get anywhere more socialist than the East End of Glasgow. Now you can't find a socialist at all. You've actually got, of course, the Cranky's love child, known as Mrs. Sturgeon, and they've basically taken away a very important number of Labour votes, which means it's almost impossible for them to get an overall majority without having to come to a deal with other parties, which they obviously don't want to try and do. But yes, you're quite right. Is this playing into Labour's hands? Yes, but the trouble is, Labour's leadership is just looking weak and insipid. It's not the individual concerned is perfectly, he's not a bad politician, that's fine, but he's not a leader. He is what he trained as is a lawyer. He's actually just really rather good at actually being a quite good citizen. Get him to do your conveyancing, be brilliant. To actually lead the Labour Party with enthusiasm and to get them the verve necessary to beat the Tories, he's not your man. So again, that reflects on the view from the external world. You have an untried Prime Minister coming in who's done a lot of jobs, but not for very long. And then you also have people looking at the rest of the team there, and it doesn't give them a great deal of confidence as to what's happening. I wish them well. I hope it's going to be successful. People have made references to the Barber boom back in the 70s, where there was a dash for a quick successful investment in the economy, and that went horribly wrong. So trying to actually encourage that sudden growth is it's not imaginative, it's not very clever, it doesn't normally work. Now, tied together with actually, I suppose inevitably going to come around, people start talking about trickle-down economy. But we've been talking about trickle-down economy for donkey's years. And frankly, it doesn't. If you're a multi-millionaire and you've got 50,000 tax break, are you going to go out and buy what? Another car or something? It doesn't really happen. The people who actually want to make sure will spend the money will be those at the other end of society, because they have to spend the money. And so very different indeed. So it's the issue with this, I think, is no clear thought out plan. The other element to this, which is worth highlighting, and I know we've discussed before, the largest employer by sector in the United Kingdom is smaller companies. And we've been really good at setting up smaller companies. We set up more than France and Germany put together. It's very impressive, very entrepreneurial. Back 60 years ago, we weren't very entrepreneurial at all. So something's happened. The problem is with that, actually, if you've then got these small companies facing huge tariff levels that are increasing on electricity, albeit capped for the short term, that's not a matter of saying we'll lay off a couple of members of staff. No. These are cataclysmic numbers we're talking about, where you actually lose quite a number of those smaller businesses, which is, as I say, the most dynamic part of our economy. And really the one that, if we want to focus on successes, particularly around technology, that's where we need to be. But as classic example, you see virtually every fortnight or so, insignificant tech business having grown effectively, but gets to sort of the next third or fourth round of funding, and lo and behold, someone comes in from the States or elsewhere, likes the technology, boom, it's gone. So we're really good at setting it up. We're bloody awful at doing the secondary financing for it and make sure it stays here. And so these, to me, are some of the really key strategic issues we want to make sure politicians are looking at. So strategic issues, and I'm afraid this mini budget wasn't strategic. It was a tactical idea to maybe, on the positive side, shake people up and find another way of doing it. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but not necessarily really thought through to say, strategically, where do we want to be in 20 years' time? And of course, all politicians don't think in 20 years' time, they think to the next election. So it is a difficult way to try and manage. It doesn't put us in a very good position at the moment because the growth is weakening elsewhere. And we're beginning now to see the impact of not being in the single market because we don't have that flexibility to get in there. And if we do want to go back, it's going to cost us. and you're not going to have the deal that you had before. But that's way ahead from where we are now. So trying to get the idea of the market moving, that's perfectly laudable. But I'm afraid some of the issues they're talking about really are, there's nothing particularly new there, and nothing which has inspired the market to say, actually, that's quite good. We quite like the idea of that. Here's more capital going into this country. Country's good at developing the companies, and that's where you get your greater companies in the future. So we've been our own worst enemy with that, I'm afraid.
So when you're asked where should we put our money, how do you answer that for the next year or two?
Well, if there's one thing to talk about strategically, is that you try to think longer term. Hopefully, if you were saying this time last year, what should you be doing? I know we have said this. You do something which is nice and dull. You have a well-spread portfolio across all the asset classes. But in those, say a year ago, you would have been worried about the fixed interest market anyway, government gilt market. So you should be very, very light on all of those anyway. But even in recessions, there are companies that can still do well. And those are the companies that were still needed during recessions. So anybody who's actually providing supermarket food and all those sort of issues there, they will carry on. But it's going to be extremely difficult, as I said, for those smaller businesses to be able to survive this sort of shock. And again, there's been very little mention of this. This is more important to me than, unfortunate elderly people saying, is it heating or eating? That's a dreadful position to be in. But if we are actually saying we're going to risk losing a whole swathe of our growing businesses, then that is strategically the wrong thing for the government to do. So short-term planning doesn't solve the strategic long-term view.
And of course, the other point people made to me today was, which is the one that's been in the paper, you cut income tax to 45% tax, and footballers and directors on £1 million or £10 million all save lots of money when nurses are, we need nurses in hospitals. Now, of course, that's a fantastic point for Labour to milk, but they don't seem to be very good at milking it. But it does seem a very sort of odd thing to do to me as a sort of middle of the road guy.
Yeah, it is. I come back to the point that is actually, there should be a message which is totally clear to everybody. This is what we're trying to do with the economy. But because you had so much power one on top of the other into this huge, great sandwich, the message got lost. And it sounded as if it was just trying to be clever. And the bit that does get picked up, of course, is the adjustment for high rate tax for super wealthy. But of course, that's actually not the major issues on this. The major issues is actually trying to make sure that you've got better use of your money going into those key areas. But there is no shortage of investable money in this country. I bored you with this before. We have to improve the mechanisms whereby people can invest more directly into regional, local businesses. And are not just seen as something which is done by the City of London, because that operates quite honestly as a cartel in many circumstances. So there's a lot more areas of reform that we could do here, and areas of reform that you go back to Mrs. Thatcher. She was keen to try and do, but she ran out of time, and her day was long past by that stage. But she was the one who got us into the single market. That's where you needed to be, and then wanted to make sure there was proper single market for finance operations as well, what there isn't at the moment, because London would have found itself in a very good position to lead that for the EU. So I'm afraid another missed opportunity. Doesn't mean we're wasting at all. We're still going to be attracting businesses in this country, but not at the same rate as we had before. And to sit there and hear people saying, well, we want to be like Singapore. Really? No, I don't think we're anything like Singapore at all. You're not going to be able to change that. But we do have dynamic areas. We've all heard of Silicon Beach, Silicon Fen, Silicon Glen, Silicon Gorge, Silicon Roundabout. But these are just examples of where high-tech companies in an area where they're provided with the sensible infrastructure. And sensible infrastructure is high-speed, whatever you like to call it, fibre. And one of the last things that the EU did for Cornwall was to actually put in, I'm sure it doesn't cover the whole county, ultra high speed internet operations, which is why the Cornish voted to leave. Very strange. But you can see some good examples actually in Cornwall. There's a place called Hale, which is opposite St Ives. St Ives is very pretty, a lovely looking place. Hale is the wrong end of it. Then if St Ives is the elbow, then Hale is the other part of the anatomy. They got a little business park there, and it was fascinating to see the business park in terms of the developments they were having running for some fascinating 3D production of stuff, but also international control of drill bits around the world live, being controlled from there, and they could identify which ones are wearing out, have them have them replaced. 3D printer would work on that overnight, and it was off the following day. This is dynamic stuff. So again, focus on that. Productivity, again, was one of those that comes up every time. No company goes out of its way to say, I'm going to be less productive today. Jolly good. Everyone wants to be productive. But the trouble is different types of productivity. We have productivity based on cheap labor coming in. And so we can actually give ourselves better margins because of that. That area has now changed. Really, productivity is how much benefit you can get out of technology. And I'm pleased to say this government is actually putting that up so that your technological investments can be offset. And that needs to be, in my view, increased further still. Encouragement of business to invest both domestically and internationally. It's the way you'll give more confidence to people, because if they're seeing more businesses setting up or growing, properly measurable, good stories attract good stories.
Mm. Well, it's great to talk about some positives, because we did talk about that when we rehearsed it, didn't we? How did we find some positives out of that? So thank you for that. We're still the fifth richest country in the world, aren't we, by GDP?
Yeah, we are. India will be overtaking us at some stage, but certainly not there. And of course, the French aren't in it at all. And so, no, it's don't knock it. This is, of course, one of the interesting issues with the Russian war. You know, in Britain, we get upset anytime anyone fires a missile anywhere and immediately shouts, that's £250,000. Well, remember, the Russian economy is round about half the size of the British economy. Half the size of it. The country is huge, but it's not in a position to be particularly strong like that. So it's a dangerous country, but it's not a superpower. And so how long can they carry on fighting like this? And they could for quite some time, but a lot of their cash was put into different banks outside Russia, and a lot of those, of course, are subject to sanctions. So I'm afraid that there's no easy answer to that one either. But I do take some comfort that actually that financial pressure will force Russia at some stage to do something. Does that mean the fall of the leader? The answer is yes, quite likely. But he's no fool. I'm sure he's going around checking everybody's telephone bugs to see who is actually plotting against him. But frankly, that's probably the best thing we can do.
Yeah.
Don't shoot him, because we don't want a martyr.
Now, we always turn to the US economy because we're led by the world's still led by the US economy. China, we worry about. Taiwan, all sorts of things there. One of the questions, was somebody sent in was, can the US economy always continue as a reserve currency, or is it under too much pressure from China?
That's an interesting point. China's currency isn't really a reserve currency at the moment. A lot of countries are beginning to use it as a reserve, but the problem is its operations are less than clear. And also the ability to trade the yuan is not straightforward either. Those sort of elements mean, therefore, that someone who is really trying to be clever about what is reserve currency and not would mean that China doesn't count at the moment. The US dollar will remain the reserve currency for the time being. Why? Because of the sheer size of the economy. And so that's not going to change anytime soon. So what is going to be interesting is actually what happens in the next stage of government financing. And I'm not going to be talking here about the likes of Bitcoin and things, but the technology behind Bitcoin in terms of block trading, block structure, will mean that actually governments could own very strong, much more secure funding mechanisms and debt management systems. Forgive me if I'm being patronizing, but actually all that the likes of Bitcoin are doing, it's effectively like having a spider's web. And when you touch that spider's web, every single part of that web knows about it, where it is, who it is, and adjusts accordingly. So in terms of security, that's a great thing for banks, for central bankers to be able to have. But watch this space to see how that develops. You're not going to get, I think, much funding via that route. But in terms of actual overall control, security control, which is increasingly important, that's probably going the way forward. So I'm not interested in the Bitcoin side of it, if only for the ESG as a green part of it. It costs so much to actually operate the system. But it's not regulated properly, and it doesn't have a very good track record. So if you want to invest in things like that, that's why we have horse racing.
Or premium bonds I've gone for. I don't know whether that seems quite good.
I'm sure I've got some Green Shield stamp booklets around somewhere.
Yeah, I remember those. There was a question, and you've probably answered it, but I'll ask you again. Is Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme, or is it a hedge against currency fluctuations?
It's interesting. Is it a Ponzi scheme? I remember the whole idea of the Ponzi scheme was actually just a bit like Bernie Madoff. I've got the perfect name for a scoundrel. In charge of your investment, Mr. Madoff with your money. And you found over the years, Derek, that the number of times you come across firms that people say, these are brilliant, they're fantastic. And who actually has the strength of character to turn around and say, prove it. Show to me this is actually what you're saying it is. Madoff had a fantastic level of stable investments for about 12 years. And the man's a genius. All these other impacts didn't affect him at all, to the extent that he even ended up being the head of NASDAQ for a while. And yet, someone did actually finally blow the whistle, and he went 2 floors up from his office, and there was the funds being run as a typical Ponzi scheme. So to go back to the point, is Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme like that? No, because there's no one center which will be doing it. Are people trading it in order to get rich quick rather than a proper investment? Yes, they are. That's how they treat it. If you're prepared to take the risk of 100% loss and you can suffer that, then that's for you. So if you want to have a very, very small of your part of your portfolio involved in it, which may then become subsequently even smaller, at least you are joining in with it. But don't let the pension money anywhere near that.
And so what about the geopolitical risks? Seem to have gone up a lot over the last 2 years. China and India seem to be supporting Putin, don't they? And there's the South China Sea, there's the Taiwan issue, and has Putin got control of the button? There's a few things.
There's a few, yeah. Okay, well, also bear in mind with this, China is probably one of the cards we should be playing against Russia, because the last thing the Chinese want to have is someone else behaving badly on their border. So the comments from Xi the other day about a level of restraint being required, you have to interpret that through the sort of Chinese whispers that actually, as far as they're concerned, they want Russia to actually bring this to a close in some way or other. So again, China's in a strange position. You're talking about what's happening in the economy, the housing market's still in a mess, its banking system is not good. And the reporting structure, half the time we don't believe what we're being told in this country about report accounts. We always used to joke about how many report accounts did a company in Italy have. One for the bank, one for the tax revenue, one for you, all completely different. China is exactly the same, and it's untrustworthy figures. So you really have very little idea of actually how valuable these are. What you can say is this is an economy which is having a growing middle class who wish to buy the items the middle class will want to have, but they're also in a position where they've got a terrible demographic. They're running out of young people. And so you're going to end up with an economy which is skewed to the wrong end. And how they try and address that, it's going to be interesting. I don't know how many Korean comfort women you're going to need for that one. I'm sure I probably shouldn't say that. But if you want to make money, go and set up an English branded a retirement home for wealthy Chinese men to be able to sort that one out.
Justin, we nearly come to the end of our time on the recording, so let me just take it a little bit off piece, and hopefully you'll stay on for some more questions. But what did you notice about the Queen's funeral and the politicians? Did you notice anything? You're curious like me. What did you see? What did you notice?
It was, apart from being suitably cynical and loving a juicy story, watching the stance and behavior of Prince Andrew, trying desperately to work his way back into some form of social acceptability, which I hope he doesn't achieve. His elder brother doesn't want him there anyway. No, what you did see was actually the sort of respect, which was fantastic for a lady who's gone from empire to fifth nation in the world, and the Commonwealth, which for many years we've all sort of shaken our heads and said, what's the point of it? There's a lot more that could be done with the Commonwealth, It is fascinating. People still see it as a useful place to go and actually have negotiations and reach a consensus of action. And it's non. There isn't a political angle to it in terms of it's another way of the Brits trying to get back in. So that's actually has been quite successful. So one of the great things as her legacy will be that. And it's very difficult because remember, these people, and this is I think what Meghan Markle didn't quite understand, the royal family service us. And they are in a position where they're paid for by us. Okay, they own a lot of property and stuff like that. But it doesn't have to go too far before Brits actually don't necessarily be totally tied to their monarchy. For me, I'm very happy to have monarchy because I do actually see it as stands us apart from going to French palaces, but there's no one living in them. So actually our palaces, may not necessarily be as attractive, but at least they're working operations in there overall, which stands it apart. The real reason I think with having a monarchy rather than anything else is I don't want President Blair or some other leftover political hack. And actually you've got something which is completely separate, doesn't actually spread across the board, cost a whole fortune, because of course, how many of those properties does she actually own? The answer is not many. So what I got out of it was actually just a level of strength for the monarchy. However, this could be easily dissipated if Charles starts having views on his own. I don't know if everyone got the chance to see the play Charles III, but it was 5-6 years ago now. And that was actually showing what would happen with Charles and then with William and Kate, and how they sort of fell apart. And Charles finding himself effectively deposed. No, the point is this: the monarchy is there because it's an alternative to a presidency. It's never going to have political power, nor do we want it to do so. It's also a jolly good little marketing budget as well. So what did I get out of that? An element of pride, because we do pageant politics. We're bloody good at, and so use that, because frankly, if you have that coming from Germany, not quite the same thing. You really don't want to see too many Germans wandering down the street saluting you with their heads sticking out of their tanks. They've done that before a couple of times. It did not end well.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I understand the Queen's motto was never complain, never explain, which is an interesting psychological move.
Yeah, and I think that underlines actually why Meghan got it wrong. She thought, in effect, and Virginia would know much more about this than I would, but that she would actually be weighted on hand and foot because now you're part of the royal family, not realizing actually the royal family are there to be very, very good at opening small curtains. That's their primary use in life. And the idea that Meghan, I think, didn't really understand what service meant and the amount of work they'd have to put in to justify their existence. It surprised me, actually, that the royal family has lasted quite so well, considering the issues we've had over Prince Andrew and various other elements of scoundrels around the place. The likes of Fergie attracted definitely the wrong attention. Anyway.
Last thing, very, very last thing. Clearly, we need our friends in the US to get closer to. We're not really doing very well with Joe Biden and the issue with Ireland, which concerns me a bit. But I also noticed he was in the 14th row at Westminster Abbey. I thought that was a bit off, actually, but we might talk about that with my American friends later. But yeah, I
did love that coming through, because actually I think it was one of those the American political talk shows, and quoting what Trump when his tweets were coming through about how he would have done it. He wouldn't be left in the 14th row. Well, that frankly just sums him up. So you couldn't get his ego into the through the archway anyway.
Justin, thanks for joining us yet again. I hope you'll come back in 3 months' time and we'll review all your advice and see where we are. Probably everything will have changed again. It will have changed, but we can easily talk ourselves into a recession. We can talk ourselves into being terribly depressed about things. Remember, although we are in a technical recession at the moment, an awful lot of people still employed, paying taxes, earning money. So everything doesn't stop. But you've got to be very careful. It wouldn't take too much. Again, that question of confidence again, that we find it too expensive to service our debt.
that puts us in a very difficult position.
Can I ask members of Monday Night Live to give Justin the usual round of applause in the normal way, even though your machines are off? Justin, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We look forward to seeing you again, and your wisdom is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure and a great privilege. Derek, you're doing a great job there. I find it fascinating. Well done.
Thanks, Justin.